Picture this. It's the morning of August 6, 1945. A single American B-29 bomber flies over the city of Hiroshima. The sky is a perfect, peaceful blue. But in a single flash, that peace is shattered. A city is literally erased from the map, and a terrifying new chapter in human history begins.
Look, before we get into the politics and the strategy, we have to start right here, with the human reality. The descriptions from people who were there, they're almost impossible to imagine. People walking like ghosts, their skin just sliding off their bodies. This wasn't just a bigger bomb, it was a completely new kind of horror. And then you see a number like this. That's the estimated human toll in Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the end of 1945. Nearly 250,000 people. It's a number so big it's hard to even wrap your head around. And these weren't just soldiers. We're talking about men, women, and children, gone in an instant from the blast, the firestorms, or the slow, invisible poison of radiation. The scale is just staggering. So we know what happened. That part is clear. But the why? Well, that is still fiercely debated. Was this a terrible but necessary act to end a brutal war and save countless lives? That's the official story many of us grew up with. Or was it something else? A cold, calculated display of power aimed at a future enemy? That's the question at the heart of everything we're going to explore.
So let's start at the beginning, right? How did these specific cities end up being chosen for total destruction? And what was it actually like on the ground for the people who saw that fire fall from the sky?
The targets were not chosen at random. Not at all. The process was actually pretty fascinating. The initial list of cities included Kyoto, Japan's ancient capital. But Secretary of War Henry Stimson took it off the list. He was thinking ahead, you know? He argued that if the US wanted to govern Japan after the war, destroying its cultural soul would create a bitterness that would never heal. At the same time, many of the scientists who actually built the bomb were begging for a demonstration, maybe on an unpopulated island, to show its power without the massive loss of life. But the generals on the target committee, they said no. They argued that to create the psychological shock needed to force a surrender, it had to be used on a living city. So Hiroshima was chosen for its role as a military headquarters. Nagasaki, a key port, ended up being the backup target when clouds covered the primary, Kokura.
You hear all the statistics, but it's the small, surreal details from survivors that really hit you. This is unforgettable. A person recalled seeing a lunchbox where cooked white rice had instantly turned into black sand. It wasn't burned. The intense thermal radiation had just fundamentally changed it in a split second. That's the kind of physics-defying horror that statistics just can't capture.
All right, so let's dig into the official justification. This is the argument that's been taught in American schools for decades, that the bomb, as horrific as it was a grim necessity, that it was used to end the war and, believe it or not, to actually save lives.
This quote, often attributed to President Truman, it really cuts right to the heart of the military necessity argument. By 1945, the war in the Pacific was a nightmare of island hopping, with casualties that were just off the charts. For Truman, who was brand new to the presidency, the math was brutal and simple. It was a choice between Japanese lives and American lives. And for him, as the American commander-in-chief, that choice was clear.
Military planners were looking at some truly awful math. Just look at the Battle of Okinawa, which had just finished. It was a terrifying preview of what an invasion of Japan itself, codenamed Operation Downfall, would look like. On that one small island, the US took nearly 50,000 casualties. The Japanese lost over 200,000 soldiers and civilians. When you project those numbers onto a full-scale invasion of the mainland, you get these horrifying estimates of over 1 million Allied casualties and millions of Japanese deaths. So in the face of that, the bomb looked like, well, the lesser of two truly terrible evils.
And you have to remember what was happening on the other side. By 1945, Japan's military was preparing the entire country for one last suicidal defense. They were literally training civilians, including women, to fight American invaders with bamboo spears. The plan was to make the invasion so bloody that America would be forced to negotiate a peace. From the American point of view, Japan's absolute refusal to surrender meant that only a massive, overwhelming shock could break their will to fight to the last person.
But this wasn't an easy call, not by a long shot. This entry from Truman's own diary shows he knew exactly what he was about to unleash. He wasn't naive about its power. He called it the fire destruction prophesied. He understood he was holding something apocalyptic. But in his mind, he was using that fire to end the world's biggest war and to stop an even bigger bloodbath on the beaches of Japan. But what if that's not the whole story? There's another, much more cynical interpretation of all this. A theory that the bomb's primary target wasn't really Tokyo at all, but Moscow. This is the idea that those mushroom clouds were really the opening act of the Cold War.
And a huge part of this theory comes down to the man who made the call, Harry Truman. His predecessor, Franklin Roosevelt, had managed a tough but working alliance with Joseph Stalin. He saw the Soviets as the necessary partner to beat Hitler. Truman, on the other hand, was a hardcore anti-communist. He came into office deeply suspicious of Stalin's plans. He didn't see a partner, he saw the next great global enemy. And that shift in perspective is absolutely crucial.
To back this idea up, some historians point to the firebombing of Dresden in Germany just a few months earlier. The military value of Dresden was debatable, but its destruction was absolute, killing tens of thousands of civilians. The argument is that it wasn't really about defeating Germany, which was already collapsing. It was about showing Stalin the terrifying power of Allied air forces, a message about who was going to call the shots in post-war Europe.
And this quote from a historical analyst, well, it pretty much says it all, right? In this version of events, Hiroshima wasn't the last shot of World War II, it was the first shot of the Cold War. It was a brutal message to Stalin to back off in Europe and Asia. It was America announcing that there was a new world order, and with its exclusive atomic club, it was sitting at the very top.
Okay, so we've got these two big competing arguments, military necessity versus a warning to Moscow. But now we have to add a third piece to the puzzle, and this one is a huge factor that's often overlooked, but it might just be the most important part of the story: the moment the Soviet Union entered the war. You have to look at the timeline here, because the sequence of events is everything. On July 26, the Allies demand unconditional surrender. Japan says no. August 6th, Hiroshima is bombed. But now, pay very close attention to August 9th. At midnight, the Soviet Union declares war and launches a massive invasion of Manchuria. Just a few hours later, the second bomb is dropped on Nagasaki. 6 days after that, the Emperor of Japan announces the surrender. The timing is just incredibly significant.
See, up until that very moment, Japan's leaders were clinging to one last sliver of hope, that they could get the Soviets to mediate a peace deal for them, a deal that would let them keep their emperor. The Soviet invasion didn't just shatter that hope, it obliterated it. Suddenly, they were facing a hopeless two-front war, with the Americans in the south and the Soviets now pouring in from the north. For many historians, this was the real final straw, the loss of their last diplomatic option, even more than the bombs themselves.
And the Soviets were not just sitting around. At the Potsdam Conference, Truman told Stalin about a new weapon of unusual destructive force. Stalin played it cool, but he already knew about the Manhattan Project from his spies. As soon as Hiroshima was hit, a Soviet intelligence team was on the ground, scooping up radioactive soil and evidence to figure out how to build their own. By August 20th, just 11 days after Nagasaki, Stalin officially put the Soviet bomb project on the fast track, under the control of his ruthless secret police chief. The nuclear arms race was on.
So, where does all of this leave us? Decades later, the physical dust is settled, but the moral and political fallout? That's still with us, shaping not just the relationship between America and Japan, but the entire world.
The aftermath is full of these strange contradictions. The US has never formally apologized, always maintaining it was a military necessity, and yet America also led a massive effort to rebuild the very country it had just devastated. This led to the famous Japanese economic miracle. But then, when Japan became an economic rival in the 80s, the US stepped in to curb its growth. And to this day, you have powerful voices, like the former mayor of Hiroshima, arguing that the whole bombs saved lives story is a dangerous myth that we have to challenge if we want to prevent it from ever happening again.
And in the end, after all the geopolitics, the military calculations, and the historical debates, you're left with voices like this. The supposed words of a dying child, who, in the face of all that horror, could only promise to tell a higher power what happened. It's just a statement of such profound innocence and a haunting indictment of the world the adults had made.
So we're left with the question, was it a brutal but necessary end to a world war, or the cynical first move in the Cold War? The real answer is probably a messy combination of it all. But wrestling with that question still matters. It matters because how we tell these stories about our past shapes what we do in the present. And trying to understand why we first used the ultimate weapon is absolutely essential, because we still live in a world under its shadow.